This will be our review for Test 2, which we'll be taking next Tuesday. Evening students or hybrid students, if you want to come during the day to take the test, it is next Tuesday. Just send me an email to say you're coming during the day. If something happens during the day and you all miss the test, make sure that you come Tuesday night. It starts at 6. There is a 10-point penalty for not taking the test on time, and that's in your syllabus. So you don't want to lose those points if you're not taking it on time. If you are working on Sullivan, your test will look just like that. You're doing the entire process, the accounting cycle, for 1 month. You won't be doing it for 2 months.
Okay.
And for each one of the sections, I always try to give you new numbers. So if you make a mistake on your worksheet, that then those numbers don't carry forth to the statement of owner's equity, the balance sheet, the income statement. So you have different numbers. So when you're working through the test, make sure that you're taking the numbers that I'm giving you. And I don't always tell you whether that has a debit balance or a credit balance. So you're going to have to know on the trial balance where you put those numbers. If you're working on something and you can't just not work on it, make sure you turn your monitor off so that you're paying attention. I have lots of 100s on test 2, so I expect to see 100s this time. We didn't have any 100s on test 1, but some of the scores were very good. Some of the mistakes that were made were sort of careless mistakes. So there's no prize for getting finished first. So take your time, go back and look at that. Make sure you have the dollar signs. Make sure you have straight lines. Make sure you've labeled everything. If it's a number that you're subtracting, how do we identify that? With the parentheses. Okay, so put the parentheses around. If you're working on Sullivan and you turn it in before the test on Tuesday, I told you I would offer extra credit. Maria's already finished with her. She finished it today. So do that. When you're working and you have a deadline, sometimes I really get busy and I usually work right up until the deadline. I hardly ever turn in something early because my list, if you've ever come to my office, it is huge. And I start that new list every week. I'm a checker offer person. I like to see that I've done it. I have to write it down so that I don't have to think about it again. But my list just continues. It just usually stays the whole length of that notebook that I have in my office. But in the workforce, if you turn in something early, that's a good thing. Then somebody else that needs to process something after you, then they can get started early. I try not to turn in anything late because even in here, then you're penalized. If the tardiness occurs in the workplace, you could lose your job. And I've told 2 of my students this semester, if they worked for me, I would have fired you. You can't do that in the workplace. Every chapter something is late. You can't do that. Practice here, getting those good skills to get things completed. So if you turn it in early, I like to reward you with that. So when is Sullivan due? It's due Tuesday. The checks are free. If I haven't checked your June, you've got to get that to me. You have to be working on it. And how many hours did the book say it would take? 5. Did it take 5, Maria?
More than 5.
Okay.
Because even with this stuff on some balance, it doesn't balance.
And does the book give us some check figures?
No.
Oh, it didn't? Well, here's a note. Some of the problems, it gives you a check figure, but those check figures are not right. Have you found that on some of the problems? Don't trust the check figures in the book. I think I have a list of corrections for the book in course documents if you want to print that off. There's lots of mistakes in there. So don't say, oh, I didn't get that check figure. I need to keep working on that because something's not right. In QuickBooks and Peachtree, I give my students check figures, but some of them still turn in work with the wrong numbers. I don't grade it if it has the wrong numbers. I give it back and say, redo, find your mistake. I gave you the numbers. In the real world, we don't have check figures, do we? So if you don't know that it's wrong, I mean, I'm telling you, if your numbers don't match mine, it's wrong. Redo it. You can still get a 100, but if you turn it into me, it's not worth a 100. So I'm teaching you how to do that, so I'm not going to just mark it wrong. I want you to fix it. I don't usually give partial grades in accounting at all. I can't. It's either right or it's wrong in accounting, isn't it? It can't be close. I like the saying, close only counts in horseshoes, hand grenades, and slow dancing. That's all. Close in accounting doesn't count. It has to be exact. So sometimes I think we learn a little more if we try to find our mistake. But if you're doing Sullivan and I'm checking, guess what? You're going to ace that test because you're going to know it. You're going to know how to do all of the hands-on part. The multiple choice, that comes from your vocabulary. It comes from the summaries at the end of the chapter. It comes from my accounting tutor that's in here. Some of those questions for the test 1, they were just like those in my accounting tutor, weren't they?
I don't know.
I don't like tricky questions. There was another instructor and I that put those questions, our question banks together. They didn't all come from the book, but you've got to read the question. You can't just come to the first one that you think might be correct and select that one, because you've got to read all of the answers. It's hard to put together a multiple choice accounting test. I really prefer the hands-on. Look at the chapter summaries. We have 3, 4, and 5. We're also going to see some things from 1 and 2, those vocabulary terms. You're going to have to still know those in order to answer some of the questions. But the summary at the end is very good to look at. The vocabulary words, there's not just a list of vocabulary words. It's they're just in a different color. I hope this is recording. Oh, it is good. It's just, they're in a different color. They just didn't give you a vocabulary list. Go back and do a couple extra things in my accounting lab if you want to. Sullivan, by the way, is in my accounting lab, but we're doing it on paper. So you can go in there and look at those transactions. It's the only comprehensive problem that did come from the book. The other 3 I created.
You said we did the credit, we did the Sullivan on computer.
Only if you do Sullivan and Peachtree.
Oh, in Peachtree.
Once we do Peachtree, and we'll probably do it, this is week 6, maybe week 7. Week 7 or week 8, we'll do Peachtree. I'm not in any hurry to do it. I usually put it like at week 4, but we decided we wouldn't do it. I still have some people that are having trouble with debits and credits. And you've got to know your debits and credits to do Peachtree. That's appalling to me. And it comes from, number 1, not doing your homework, and not going back and watching the videos if you missed a day. And this is college, so I'm not going to keep after you. I sent you my little love note that says you're missing your homework for chapter whatever. I will send you that for a while, and then I'll stop. Okay? And you just set yourself up for failure when you don't do the homework. Remember my accounting class? We had lots of homework, but it never got picked up, it never got graded. But I had to do it or I couldn't take the test. And we couldn't use a calculator on the test, so I always did my homework without a calculator. So it takes longer. Now you can use a calculator on the CPA exam. I think the accounting instructors thought everybody was going to be a CPA. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to teach accounting. So I knew what I wanted to do, but I still had to take the same accounting that the CPA, the accounting majors were taking. So I had to take the test just like they did without a calculator. Now you can use a calculator on the CPA exam, thank goodness. Someone in my QuickBooks certification class is studying for their CPA exam. It'd be interesting to have him come back and talk to us after he takes it. So he's studying for it. And he's taking that class, the QuickBooks class, to be better prepared for it. So here's the review for test 2. It's chapters 3, 4, and 5. Vocabulary. Go back and look at that. Steps in the accounting cycle, and that's what you're doing in Sullivan. Okay, we started with the source documents, and there's little pictures of them in the book. And as you go through, you're having to look at those deposit slips and say, what happened here? We received money, right? If we're writing a check, we are Sullivan, so if it's one of our checks, or if we're receiving checks, then what do we have to do? You know, is that a debit or a credit when we're receiving? It's a debit to cash. Cash is the easiest one to remember, and you can get about 80% to 85% of your transactions correct if you memorize cash. All right, the next section, journalize the transactions, and you'll see the initial investment, the revenue withdrawals, paid expenses, received cash, your adjustments, and when we do the adjustments, and you'll get 2 times to practice those in Sullivan, we don't have to write a description because up at the top, we can write adjusting entries. Same with the closing entries, and we'll do a little review of how we close the accounts. How we post, that's the most time-consuming thing that we do. The steps in posting, and there are 5, the date, the journal page, and we're only using the general journal. GJ4, if you're posting the adjusting and closing entries in Sullivan. Okay, it was 4.
6.
And then 6 for July. It was 4 for June. Calculate the new balance. So on some of your homework, I noticed that some of you are just carrying that transaction number over to the balance, but the balance is a running total of those accounts. So if you have a debit balance and then you have another debit, we need to add. If you have a debit and then you have a credit, you've got to subtract. So you're calculating the new balance. We want to know what we had in cash. We can go directly to that ledger page and know what we have. Now sometimes in our simulations, you may go on the opposite of the normal balance side. If cash ends up with a credit balance and then we make a deposit, then it goes back to the debit side. But occasionally it will go on the wrong side. And if we have a credit balance in cash, we have just written a check before we've made the deposit. If it's transactions that are occurring on the same day, it's just how we posted those. So it's just the order. We really might not be overdrawn. If we are, then we probably have a service charge from the bank or a return check. And we don't want to have that. In Chapter 6, we're going to be talking about checking accounts. If you have a business checking account, I would get to know someone at the bank that approves overdrafts because you don't want a check return. Some of the banks have gone back to having like a personal banker that's assigned to you that you can call. Some banks, I have to pay extra if I go into the bank and make a deposit face-to-face instead of using the ATM. You know, that's just crazy. I don't have a personal banker where I have my checking account. So if you have a business, I would get to know someone at the bank that if you have an issue, then they'll look at that and say, maybe we should go ahead and pay that and charge them, or give them a call to see what's going on. One of my first jobs at a bank was the overdraft clerk. And we had 5 branches, and I had 5 printouts of accounts that were overdrawn. I never approved a check, but I took it around to the officers to look at it to say, this is your account, do you want to approve it? This was back in the 70s, and banks got in a lot of trouble by approving overdrafts back then because it's a free loan, isn't it? If you're overdrawn $50,000 on your business account and your personal banker approves it, they just lost money, didn't they? So the banks, and this bank did sort of get in trouble, but I always had an officer to initial it before I approved it and let it be paid because it came out in the overdraft notice. And that was just a list that got printed off every night. How far have we gone down there?
The steps.
We were going through the steps of the posting, okay? And there's 5. And then the last step is to carry that account number back to the journal to show that you posted. Remember, everybody made a promise that you wouldn't put that number in there until you finished posting. Prepare the trial balance. It's just another informal financial statement. It doesn't have dollar signs on it. It does have straight lines, and it is done on a specific date. Anything like the trial balance, the balance sheet, the post-closing trial balance, we're doing that on a particular day. The other financial statements are usually for that fiscal period, whether it's a month, a quarter, a year, whatever it is. Write the worksheet. And that's what you're doing 2 times in Sullivan. I've been checking some of yours. It does have a little strange way of how we calculate the last 4 columns. Remember, if it's a net income, we are going to use the outside 2 columns, which would be the debit on the income statement, the credit on the balance sheet. How large do we want the net income to be? Large, outside 2 columns. How large do we want the net loss to be? Really small, inside 2 columns. Now, my hybrid students don't see that. So net income will be, oh great, I have to be on camera. The outside 2 columns on those last 4 columns on the worksheet. Net loss, it's the inside 2 columns. Now my question on the test won't be if it's little, is that a net loss or net income, or if it's big, is that a net loss or net income? It's going to say if it's a credit on the income statement and a debit on the balance sheet, what is it?
Net loss.
Net loss. Okay.
Credit.
Debit on the balance sheet, credit on the income statement. So you have to remember what order do we do those financial statements. It's the same way the worksheet is. Income statement, then balance sheet. So you'll have to think, okay, what's she asking on that question? It's not going to be my little demo, but this will help you, won't it? Just like what goes on the income statement. On the worksheet, I would write ICE. We don't have cost accounts yet. We'll get those in chapter 11. But we have income and we have expenses. What goes on the balance sheet? Permanent accounts. They'll be with us forever. ALP, A-L-P. Assets, liability, proprietorship. Proprietorship is what we used to call capital. I really like the ALP better than the ALLO because that E is in there and you might think that it's expenses. There's no expenses on the balance sheet. All right, worksheet. Adjustments. It's always for the amount used. So if they give us the amount of supplies at the end of the fiscal period, is that the adjustment? We have to do a calculation. Okay, that's not the adjustment. We have to find the amount that was used. Same with prepaid rent. They'll probably tell us the amount that was expired, and that's the amount that we used. So that's the adjustment. Adjusting trial balance or adjustment columns should have a total. Some of you didn't add those up. They should have a total, and the debit and credit should equal. Then on the adjusted trial balance, that's where we show our calculations from those adjustments. When you're doing the adjustments and you're given the ending balance, you can go ahead and put that on that adjusted trial balance. That's a number they gave you. So you can go ahead and put that on if you want to. Let's see. We have prepaid rent and salaries. That's the one that probably is the trickiest one to do. And that comes about if we're making a payroll into another month and we still have days that we haven't made that payroll that was in the previous month. So that's when we have to make that adjustment. And usually that adjustment will be reversed at the beginning of the next fiscal period. There's my reminders with the ALP and the ICE. Know your account normal balance. Where do we increase an account?
On the normal balance.
On the normal balance. Where do we decrease an account? Opposite the normal balance. If I give you a chart of accounts, those are the accounts that I want you to use. What's the abbreviation for debit?
DR.
Not just D. It's DR. And what's the abbreviation for credit?
CR.
Okay. Let's see. Normal balance. The ruling on the worksheet and the trial balance. Your headings are not provided. So it's the name of the company, the name of the financial statement, and then the date or the fiscal period. Straight lines. specific date or period ending, the acid test. I hope that you're still not asking yourselves those questions. But if you are, it's what accounts are affected, what's their category or classification. Is that an increase or decrease? Is that a debit or credit? If you know cash, it will help you a lot if you'll just memorize cash. You're not going to get them all correct, but if cash is a debit, then the other account has to be
Credit.
a credit. If cash is a credit, the other account has to be a debit, right? You could have a compound entry. Usually that initial investment, the owner could be giving supplies, equipment, and cash. It's a compound entry, just one entry to the capital, but then you'd have cash and equipment or cash and supplies. Could even have three. And then the fourth one would be the capital account. Capital has a normal balance on what side?
Capital.
Credit. And there's a difference between saying credit or credit. Credit, I'm not sure, maybe. Tell me yes or no, or credit. Okay, some of those have to become automatic. What's the accounting equation? Assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. Shouldn't you know those? We've been talking about that for 6 weeks now. Don't forget that. That's our whole purpose in accounting, is that accounting equation. All right, acid test, accounting equation, there it is again. Net loss, inside columns, net income, outside columns, and then the chart of accounts. If you don't have an account that fits the transaction, where do we put it? And we had to use it in Sullivan.
Miscellaneous expenses.
Miscellaneous. We haven't had miscellaneous until Sullivan, or chapter 5, I think we had miscellaneous. If it doesn't fit, if it's a telephone bill, if it's an electric bill, we may have those accounts. But what if we're paying, what if it's just an ad that we took out in the paper and we don't have an advertising expense? That's when we have to use that miscellaneous. You could have the utilities expense, and utilities could be our electric, our water, our telephone, anything that is a public owned entity, and we usually call that utilities. I think Sullivan had telephone and gas expense, didn't it? I don't remember the other expense accounts that it had, but if it doesn't fit in one of those that we already have, we don't have the authority to create a new account. So we're just going to put it under miscellaneous. And then the chart of accounts. Use that as your reference as you're trying to figure out what accounts we're going to use. Any specific questions about what's on the test?
What are the answers?
Yeah. I know. But you should be able to master the written part of it, because you're doing that in Sullivan. And I think I've told this class that I always read my evaluations at the end of the course. And several people, it was more than one, said we always had a perfect practice of what was going to be on the test because of those comprehensive problems. If you're not doing them, you won't be successful on the test. I don't do anything or make you all do anything that I don't think is beneficial. It's not busy work. It is to practice. It's a reinforcement of what's on the test, what we've covered. And we'll never finish doing what you're doing in Sullivan, because that's the accounting cycle. That's the whole purpose of what you'll be doing when you're working in the accounting field. You're starting at the fiscal period and you're completing it at the end so that we're ready to start the next period. And that period could be anything that we said. We could do that on a weekly basis. We could do that on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis. We could do that anytime we want to prepare those statements. Statement of owner's equity is one that we really didn't talk about, but that's what we're doing in the adjusting and the closing entries. We just did it on paper to change what the ending capital is, which becomes the new capital for the next fiscal period, but we never adjusted those accounts. Adjusting entries are done to bring our accounts current. It's on paper in the worksheet. The actual accounts are not current until we post adjusting and closing entries. And the closing entries, what do we close first?
Revenue into income summary.
Revenue into income summary. Then we close.
The income summary with capital first.
We have one more thing we got to do first.
Expenses.
Expenses to income summary. Then we close, not capital. We don't close capital.
Income summary.
We close income summary to capital, into capital. And remember, income summary has a normal balance on what side? It doesn't have one. And then the last one we do is the withdrawal. We don't close capital. That's a permanent account. But we have to bring it current. The new ending balance then in capital should be what we have on the statement of owner's equity. We added net income or subtracted net loss. We subtracted the withdrawals on paper. But we didn't do it to the actual accounts until we post those closing entries. So we have a lot of behind the scenes to do before we have those actual accounts current. Now when you start July on the worksheet, the first two columns, because you did a post-closing trial balance on a separate form, what numbers do we start with in July then on the trial balance? Where do we get those? Where do they come from? From the ledger. Pull them from the ledger. It's your balances that you had at the end of July. Then we have to make the adjustments. We're doing that worksheet for that period of the month of July. Pull those account numbers or the balances from the accounts that are in your ledger. Then we're making the adjustments. Then we're doing the adjusted trial balance and then the financial statements. The worksheet gives you a place to practice those financials before you put them on the official paper. Does everybody have to do a worksheet in business? No. Should they? I think. It's one of my favorite things to do. I like the worksheet. It puts it all together. Okay. Any specific questions besides what are the answers? Now, next Tuesday, day and evening, Dr. Daring will be administering the test for me. I'll probably have the name tags out for her so she knows everybody. And I'll have her take roll. I'll also know, if I don't have a test for you. So bring your calculator and eraser, pencil. Don't use your phone on the test. She'll probably be walking around, monitoring. So, you can sit at a different location if you want to, or you can sit in your regular seat. It's all right. She'll have a copy of the seating chart too. So I won't be here next Tuesday. But you'll be, you need to turn in Sullivan or turn it in Thursday. And then I can start grading those.
Once again, on the Sullivan, we do both of the months or?
You're doing both months. June and July.
So it's easy peasy.
So, and it says it takes about 5 hours. I don't know. If you sat there for 5 hours straight, maybe, but you probably don't. You did?
I haven't, but I will. It'll be better.
Yeah. Yeah. But once we get into Peachtree, if you do want extra credit, I have Sullivan in Peachtree also. Transactions are different numbers, but you can see how quickly you can do it in Peachtree. And we'll do two really easy ones, the Atlas and Zell, that we can probably finish in one class period. All right, I'm turning this off then.